A Royal Worcester cabinet cup sold at Worcestershire auction last spring for £420. It had been in a kitchen cupboard for 30 years, used as a pen holder. The woman who brought it in thought she was doing well to get a tenner. That is not a rare story. It is, if anything, a common one. And the reason it keeps happening is not that people are careless or ignorant. It is that nobody ever told them the one thing that would have changed everything. Turn the cup over. Look at the bottom. That is where this whole subject lives, and once you know what you are reading down there, you will never look at a shelf of old crockery the same way again. I am going to take you through 10 specific cups today, not as a list of expensive things you probably do not own, but as a proper education in what makes one teacup worth £2 at a car boot and another worth 200 sitting quietly in the same house. Each one teaches you something the next one builds on. By the time we are done, you will have enough to make a genuine judgment on whatever is sitting in your own cupboards. So, let us start at the bottom. The bottom of the cup is the whole story. I mean that literally. Before you look at the color, the shape, the pattern, before you think about whether it is pretty or whether you like it, turn it over. Hold it upside down and read what is there. That mark, that back stamp, is a document. It tells you who made it, roughly when, and in some cases exactly when, down to the year. Now, a lot of people see a mark on the bottom of a cup, and they think, that is just the maker's name. And yes, sometimes it is just that. But good makers, careful makers, old makers, used their marks to say considerably more. The country of origin marking, for a start. From 1891 onward, goods exported to America had to carry the country of manufacture by law. So if your cup says England, or made in England, or bone china England, that already tells you something about when it was made, or at least when the batch it came from was made for which market. Made in England rather than just England tends to push you towards the 20th century. Bone china as a description rather than fine china or nothing at all has its own rough timeline. But the really useful thing is what the specific marks tell you about specific makers. Some factories only used certain mark designs for a window of years, sometimes a decade, sometimes less. The shape of a crown, the font of the name, the presence or absence of a pattern number, a registration diamond, all of these are datable. And once you know which mark belongs to which period for a given factory, you can pick up a cup, turn it over, and know within a few years when it was made, before you have read a single price guide. That is the skill. It sounds technical, and the first time you encounter it in an auction catalogue, it looks like it might take years to learn. It does not. For the cups that matter most, the ones that regularly sit in British homes and regularly get undervalued, there are maybe a dozen marks worth knowing well. We are going to cover the most important ones today. One more thing before we get into the cups themselves. Condition matters, but it matters differently than most people think. A hairline crack through a Royal Doulton cabinet piece will drop the value significantly. A small chip on the foot rim of a Clarice Cliff piece can be negotiated around if the pattern is right. Phrasing, that fine network of cracks in the glaze, is almost always acceptable in older earthenware and will not concern a serious collector. Restoration, on the other hand, especially invisible restoration, is something buyers want disclosed and something you should look for under a UV lamp if you are spending serious money. We will talk about condition as we go through each piece. But first, the cup in your hand. Cup 1, Clarice Cliff. Everybody has heard the name by now, or thinks they have. The problem is that hearing the name and knowing what to do with a piece in front of you are two very different things. And the gap between them is where a lot of money gets left on the table. Clarice Cliff worked for A.J. Wilkinson's Pottery in Burslem, Staffordshire, from the 1920s into the 1940s. She designed under her own name from 1928, and the range was called Bizarre, that is Bizarre, which at the time was not a comment on the quality, but on the deliberately bold, angular, brightly coloured style she was pushing against the prevailing taste for delicate florals. The shapes were chunky, often geometric. The colours were loud, bright orange, cobalt, vivid yellow, strong black outlines. If you look at a piece without knowing what you are looking at, your first instinct might be that it is garish. That instinct has cost people a great deal of money over the years. Crocus is probably the most recognized Clarice Cliff pattern, and it is certainly the one most commonly encountered at car boots and in clearance houses. Purple, orange, and yellow flowers, roughly painted, on a cream or banded background. It was a production pattern, made in very large quantities, which means it turns up relatively often, but it also means the value range is wide. A crocus cup and saucer in good condition will fetch between £30 and £80, depending on who is buying and where. A crocus teapot, coffee pot, or larger piece in excellent condition sits considerably higher. But here is what I want you to remember about Clarice Cliff specifically. The market is absolutely flooded with reproductions and with pieces from later commemorative reissues, and some of those are quite well made. The way you separate an original from a later piece is not by pattern alone, it is by three things together. Weight. Genuine 1930s bazaar ware has a particular heft, a slightly uneven thickness that comes from the way it was made. Glaze depth. On an original, the colored enamels sit proud of the surface in a way you can feel with your thumbnail. On a reproduction, they tend to sit flat. And the back stamp. A genuine bazaar mark uses a particular hand-painted or lithographed script, the word bazaar in a specific style, with Clarice Cliff's name below, and Newport Pottery or AJ. Wilkinson below that, depending on the period. Later reissues often get the words right, but the execution wrong. The font is too uniform, the ink too consistent, the whole thing too neat. If you have something that looks like Clarice Cliff, and your instinct says it is too bright to be worth anything, do not move it on until you have done those 3 checks. That instinct has been wrong before. I know because it was wrong for me. Once, with a crocus milk jug at a Shropshire estate sale. I left it. I went back the next morning and it was gone. The woman running the sale said a dealer had come back for it specifically. I did not make that mistake again. Cups 2 and 3. Shelley and Foley. Hold a Shelley cup, and your first thought is usually that it is going to break. They are extraordinarily fine, these pieces. The walls of the cup sometimes barely thicker than a pound coin. Bone china so translucent that held up to a window, you can see your hand through it. Most people encountering a Shelley cup for the first time either put it down very quickly or assume that anything that fragile must be a cheap modern thing. Both reactions are wrong, and both reactions mean value gets missed. The Shelley factory in Longton, Staffordshire, had been operating under the Foley name, specifically the Foley China Works, from the 1880s. The family name was Wileman. Then from 1910 the pieces were often marked Foley with the Shelley name appearing alongside. In 1925 the company formally became Shelley Potteries, and this is your dating shortcut. If your piece is marked Foley without any Shelley alongside it, it is pre-1910 at the latest. If it carries both names, it is between roughly 1910 and 1925. If it carries only the Shelley name, it is 1925 or later. That transition, Foley to Shelley, is one of the cleaner dating tools in British ceramics, and it takes about 4 seconds to apply once you know it. The shapes that command the most attention from collectors are the more architectural ones: Queen Anne, Vogue, Mode, all from the late 1920s and 1930s, angular and modernist in a way that sits oddly against the delicate translucence of the clay body. These were made during the same broad cultural moment as Clarice Cliff's bizarre range, and they were responding to the same influence: the Paris Exposition of 1925, the push toward Art Deco geometry. A Shelley Vogue cup with the original saucer in a good pattern, Sunray, Harmony, a named floral like stocks or campanula, will fetch between £60 and £120 for the pair. A trio, cup, saucer, side plate, adds meaningfully to that. A complete 6-place setting in a sought-after pattern and shape is a 4-figure item at the right auction. The solo cup question is worth dwelling on. I said earlier that a complete Shelley trio in the right pattern regularly clears £150, and a solo cup barely makes 20. The reason is simple. The cup alone tells a collector very little about what the original set looked like, and the market for using Shelley as actual tableware rather than as display pieces has shrunk considerably. What the collector wants is the visual unity of the trio, or better, the service. So if you find a lone Shelley cup tucked in the back of a kitchen cupboard, your first question should not be, what is this worth? But where are the others? Check the same cupboard carefully. Check adjacent ones, check the sideboard. Sets get separated all the time, and the saucer that makes the cup worth having might be 3 feet away. Condition on Shelley is unforgiving. A hairline crack on something this fine is very visible and drops the value hard. A small chip on the foot rim is more negotiable. But these pieces were made to be used, and used carefully. Most of the ones that have survived in decent shape have been looked after, which means you are more likely to find them in good order than you might expect. If a piece is perfect, it is worth asking why it was kept rather than used. Cabinet display pieces, bought purely to look at, sometimes carry no use wear at all, and those fetch the top end of the range. Cups 4 and 5, Royal Crown Derby and Coalport. These are the prestige tier of English bone china, and both factories are still in production today, which is the first thing you need to sit with for a moment, because it changes everything about how you value what you find. Royal Crown Derby has been making ceramics in Derby since the 18th century. The current version of the factory, officially Royal Crown Derby since 1890, has been producing bone china almost continuously since then. Coalport has a slightly more complicated history. The original Coalport China Works on the River Severn in Shropshire started in the 1790s, and the name has passed through various hands, but pieces bearing the Coalport name have been made across a span of nearly 2.5 centuries. What this means practically is that a Royal Crown Derby cup from 1895 and one from 1955 can look quite similar to someone who does not know the marks. The colorways, the gilding style, the shapes. There is continuity across the factory's history, but the value difference between an 1895 piece and a 1955 piece is very significant, and this is where the date coding system becomes the most useful tool you will ever learn in this area. Royal Crown Derby used a system of date ciphers from 1882 onward that is essentially a cipher, a code. Each year had a corresponding mark that was printed or painted alongside the main back stamp. The system changed format a few times over the decades, but the principle holds: if you have a Royal Crown Derby piece made from 1882 onward, the date of manufacture is literally printed on the bottom. You need a reference table to read it. The Derby Collectors Guild and the Derby City Museum both maintain publicly accessible versions, and once you have the table, it takes seconds. A piece dated to the 1890s, in excellent condition, in one of the more sought-after patterns like Old Imari or Imari Scroll, is a very different proposition to the same pattern from the 1970s. Coalport used a similar system, slightly less formalized in its earlier years, but from around 1880 the marks become increasingly readable and dateable with a good reference. The key patterns to know are the older florals, particularly the ones from the Coal-Brook-Dale period, the early to mid-19th century, which were painted with a richness and density of gilding that the later factory found difficult to replicate. A genuine Coal-Brook-Dale cabinet cup from the 1840s, with the painted flower panels and the heavy gilded border, is worth serious money. The difficulty is that the later factory admired those pieces and made tributes to them, and some of those tributes are marked in ways that imply more age than they have. The practical rule for both factories: learn the date system. It is half an hour's work with a reference guide and a magnifying glass. After that, every piece from either factory you encounter anywhere will tell you its age directly. That is not something most people at a car boot know, and the ones who do not know it set their prices accordingly. Cups 6, 7, and 8. The Studio Pottery Cup. Now we change register entirely. Everything I have described so far has been factory ware, industrially or semi-industrially produced, marked with printed or lithographed back stamps, made in quantities ranging from hundreds to hundreds of thousands. The cups I want to talk about now were made one at a time, by hand, often by someone working alone, and their marks are not printed but impressed, pressed into the clay before firing, or painted by hand in a way that looks almost accidental. Lucie, Hans Koper, Bernard Leach. Those three names sit at the top of British studio pottery and command prices that still surprise people when they encounter them for the first time. A Lucie cup, a small thrown stoneware form, often with a slightly uneven rim, the glaze running in a way that suggests natural process rather than decoration, has sold at auction for several £1,000s. A Hans Koper piece, with his pressed CK monogram seal, for considerably more. Bernard Leach established his St Ives pottery in 1920 and ran it for over 50 years. A marked early Leach piece is increasingly rare and increasingly expensive. But here is what I want you to understand about studio pottery and why it belongs in this video alongside Royal Crown Derby and Shelley. The aesthetic is the opposite of what most people associate with value in ceramics. These pieces are not delicate, not translucent, not gilded. They are often dark in color, browns, grays, muted blues. They are frequently rough to the touch. The surfaces have texture. The forms are not symmetrical in the way a factory-made cup is symmetrical. To someone who has not encountered them before and who is scanning a box at a clearance house, they look like the least promising thing on the table. I know this because I nearly made exactly that mistake in Telford, at a clearance house off the Queensway, must be 15 years ago now. Box of what the man running the place called ugly brown mugs. 50p each or £2 for the box. I nearly walked past it. What stopped me was the weight. Not heavy, just right, in a way that factory stoneware is not quite right, and a small pressed seal on the base of one of the pieces. 2 letters, not quite even, pressed into the clay. I paid the £2 for the box. One piece from that box later went for over £300. I am not telling you that to show off. I am telling you because that is exactly the lesson. The most valuable cup in any given setting is quite often the one that looks like it does not belong in the same sentence as value. The ugliness is the point. The roughness is the craft. How to identify a studio pottery mark? It will not look like a factory backstamp. It will be impressed, incised or hand-painted, and often quite small. Common forms are initials in a monogram, a simple symbol, or a seal, a small shape pressed into the base. Bernard Leach used a BL monogram within a square. Lucie used an LR monogram, often with a small foot ring visible around it. Hans Koper's CTA seal is very distinctive once you have seen it once. Verification matters here more than anywhere else in this video because studio pottery attributions are also faked, and the fakes are sometimes not immediately obvious. Before you value a piece or sell it, photograph the mark. Close up, in good light, and check it against the Craft Study Centre's database, which is publicly accessible online and holds images of authenticated marks from the major British studio potters. If you cannot find a match there, contact a specialist auction house, Woolley & Wallace or Roseberis in London, before you do anything else. Do not rely on a general valuation from someone without ceramic specialism. The difference between a correctly attributed Hans Koper piece and a similar-looking studio pot by an unknown maker is the difference between a few pounds and several thousand. The wider field of studio pottery, below the very top names, is also worth taking seriously. Potters trained at the Royal College of Art in the 1950s, 1960s and 1970s, who produced smaller bodies of work and are less well known to general buyers, are increasingly collected. A signed piece from a recognized workshop, even if the name does not immediately ring a bell, is worth researching before it goes in the charity bag. Cup 9. The odd one out. When the cup is worth nothing and the saucer worth everything. This one I want you to think carefully about, because it changes the way you look at every group of crockery you encounter. I have a cup here. Or rather, I have in mind a type of cup that turns up regularly in house clearances and estate sales across the Midlands. Plain white or very lightly decorated, early 19th century. Nothing remarkable about the cup itself. No famous pattern, modest quality, not a collector's piece in isolation. Worth perhaps £3 or £4 on its own at the right venue, less at a car boot. Most people handling this sort of thing correctly move on. But sitting under that cup, or on the shelf beside it, is the saucer. And on some early English makers, particularly early Minton, Derby before the royal prefix, and some of the smaller early 19th century Staffordshire factories, The saucer and the stand, or the plate from the trio, tell a different story. Saucers were broken far more often than cups. They were the functional item, the one you rested the cup on, passed around, set down carelessly. A matching saucer in good condition from a named early factory with a clear back stamp or a readable painted pattern number is rarer than the cup, and priced accordingly. Early Minton saucers with the ermine pattern, or with early pattern numbers from the first decades of the 19th century, have sold for £60 to £100 unaccompanied. A Derby saucer with a good painted botanical panel, clear mark, no restoration, will interest serious collectors of English porcelain considerably. A complete Derby trio, cup, saucer, stand, from the late 18th or very early 19th century, in good order, is a 4-figure piece at the right sale. The practical lesson is this: never assess a group of crockery as a group. Take each piece individually. Turn each one over. If you are looking at what appears to be a mismatched or incomplete set, a cup without a saucer without a cup, a stand without either, do not assume the mismatch reduces value. In some cases, the separation happened because one component was more valuable and got taken out of the set by someone who knew what they were doing, leaving the rest behind. In other cases, the mismatch is simply the accident of 100 years of use. Either way, each piece has its own mark, its own story, and its own price. I will tell you one more thing about this. I once bought a job lot at an estate sale. 20-odd pieces, mixed crockery, clearly from several different sets. Estate agent had lumped it all together at a flat price. Cup without saucer, saucer without cup, a pair of stands that matched nothing else in the box. I paid £22 for the lot. A single Derby saucer in that box, pattern number consistent with the factory's work from around 1800, turned out to be the most valuable item on the table by a margin. The cup it had once belonged to was long gone. Did not matter. The saucer stood on its own. Cup 10. The one hiding in plain sight. Transfer print, wrong pattern, right maker. This is the category most commonly found in British homes, and the one most consistently undervalued. Blue and white transfer-printed ceramics from the first half of the 19th century, almost certainly in a box somewhere in the back of your kitchen cupboard, or on a shelf in the hallway, or being used to hold paper clips. Transfer printing, applying a design to ceramic ware through a tissue paper transfer rather than painting it by hand, was a technique developed in the 18th century and perfected in the early 19th. It allowed factories to produce highly detailed, consistent patterns in volume, and by the 1820s it had become the dominant form of decorated tableware in Britain. The patterns were often willow or pastoral scenes, or chinoiserie designs drawn from Chinese and Japanese sources or English topographical views. Country houses, bridges, castles. The names you want to know here are Spode, Davenport, and early Wedgwood. Spode, operating in Stoke-on-Trent from the 1770s, is credited with developing the blue and white transfer-printed earthenware style that became ubiquitous across Britain. Their marks are well documented and run through several clear phases. Davenport, based in Longport, Staffordshire, from the 1790s to the 1880s, produced enormous quantities of blue and white ware of variable quality. The better pieces carry a clear Davenport mark with an anchor, and the earlier the piece, the more it will interest a serious collector. Wedgwood's early blue and white, from before the company's middle period focus on creamware and jasperware, is less commonly encountered but worth knowing. Here is what separates a £2 car boot cup from a genuine piece worth £100 or more. Two things on the back stamp. First, is the maker's name present, and is it consistent with the period? Spode pieces from the early 19th century carry the name in a specific form, sometimes impressed, sometimes printed in blue, and the font and format changed at known points in the factory's history. A Spode mark in a style inconsistent with the claimed period is a warning sign. Second, is there a pattern name or number? Early 19th century Spode pieces often carry the pattern name in the back stamp, Italian, Tower, Willow, Caramanian, and so on, and those names are documented. A cup with the Italian pattern by Spode, clear printed mark, no restoration, minimal wear, will command genuine money from a collector of English blue and white. The Italian pattern has been in continuous production since around 1816, which means pieces from the original period are surrounded by later production, and distinguishing early from late is where the backstamp detail matters. Pattern name alone is not sufficient. Willow pattern was made by dozens of factories, some of them named, many of them not. A willow pattern cup without a maker's mark is not without value, but it sits in a much wider, much less specific category of blue and white ware where prices are lower. The mark is what connects the pattern to the factory, and the factory to the period, and the period to the price. The condition standard for transfer printed earthenware is somewhat more forgiving than for fine bone china. Crazing is almost universal in pieces from the early 19th century and does not reduce value significantly in the eyes of serious buyers. Light staining from use, tea or coffee discoloration inside the cup is acceptable and in many cases expected. Chips are more problematic on the rim than on the foot. Restoration, as always, should be disclosed and will reduce value, though a well-restored piece with a good mark is still worth considerably more than a chip-free piece with no mark at all. Now, what to do right now? 3 steps. Do them in order. First, turn every cup over, every single one that has been sitting on a shelf or in a cupboard for more than a few years. Handle it carefully, turn it base up, and look at what is there. If there is nothing, no mark at all, note that and set it aside. If there is something, do not try to interpret it from memory. Go to step 2. Second, photograph the mark. Not the cup, the mark. Good light, sharp focus, close in. A phone camera is sufficient if the light is right. Take 2 or 3 shots. Then check the mark against the Victoria and Albert Museum's online ceramics database, which is free, publicly accessible, and holds verified images of backstamps from the major British and European factories across several centuries. The V&A resource is the most reliable free starting point I know of. If the mark does not appear there, try the Transferware Collectors Club database for blue and white specifically, or the Shelley Group's online resources for Shelley and Foley. For studio pottery, the Craft Study Centre, as I mentioned earlier. Do not sell, give away, or charity shop anything before you have done those 2 steps. A number of times I have watched people bring things to sales that they have already sold on, or cleared out a week earlier because they did not think to look first. It is a frequent thing. The effort is 5 minutes. The potential upside is real. Third, understand which condition issues reduce value and which do not, before you let a buyer tell you your piece is worthless because of a flaw. Crazing in older earthenware, acceptable. Interior staining from use, acceptable in most cases. Hairline cracks, significant reduction in value, but disclose honestly. Chips depends on placement and size. A small chip on the foot rim of a significant piece is negotiable. A chip on the rim of a cup is more serious. Restoration. Always disclose and check under UV light if you are spending significant money. Fading of pattern. Significant for transfer printed pieces, less so for pieces valued primarily for form. And one more thing. If you find a mark you cannot identify, do not assume the piece is worthless because you cannot place it. Some of the most interesting and most valuable British ceramics came from small regional factories that operated for limited periods and left sparse records. An unidentified mark is a puzzle worth solving before it becomes a loss. My Uncle Derek had a rule he repeated every Saturday morning at that Wolverhampton market, and I have repeated it here already. But it deserves one more mention because it is the rule that covers everything in this video and everything beyond it. Never sneer at the ugly one. The one that looks wrong, the one that looks rough, the one you cannot immediately place, the one that nobody else at the table has touched. That is the one worth turning over. That habit, applied consistently, is what separates people who find value from people who car boot it for 50 pence. The mark on the bottom of a cup is not decoration. It is a document, and it tells you almost everything you need to know before you set a price. Turn every cup over before you decide it is ordinary. That is the whole lesson, and it costs you nothing. Drop a comment below if you have got a mark you cannot identify, and I will have a look at it. Next time I am going through the cast iron, you will find at the back of any clearance house and some of those are worth a great deal more than anyone is currently charging for them.